We're in Acts chapter 21. There, Paul, against the advice and urging of his traveling companions and other believers, has taken his journey to Jerusalem. And there, he, under the advice of the elders and leaders of the church in Jerusalem, their reasoning being that the Christians in Jerusalem were still very much Jewish in their cultural makeup. But anyway, they are thinking, this is my opinion, they're thinking, let's do what we can to not create any more difficulties or trouble than we have to. So they set forth 4 guys, we don't know their names, and advised Paul, take these men, pay their expenses, make a vow. They're going to shave their heads, which is a physical manifestation of the fact that they've taken a vow. And then they say, then everyone will know there is no truth in these reports about you, but that you yourself are living in obedience to the law. I can't help but think that Paul may have kind of gone at that, because part of Paul's message, the message of the gospel, is the law doesn't save you. It won't get you into heaven, and it won't keep you out. These are my words, not his, but that was the message. Well, in verse 25, as for the Gentile believers, we have written to them our decision that they should abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from the meat of strangled animals, and from sexual immorality. Of course, these were reasonable claims on the Gentile believers. Were they essential for them living in a saved relationship with Jesus? That's a question that's worth having an answer for. I'm going to leave that for you to figure out. No, I won't. I'll just tell you up front that, again, keeping the law or not keeping the law, that's not what either gets you into or keeps you out of heaven. It's the grace of Christ. Now, here's just my opinion, but I'm doing this so I can give my opinions. My opinion is that it's possible to keep all of the laws and still not go to heaven. If it's true that only the grace of God can get me in to heaven when I embrace and accept God's grace, or by me rejecting his grace, that keeps me out of heaven. If I'm right, I believe I am, I believe Paul would agree with me, though he wouldn't use those words probably, then I think it would be possible for a person to be all absorbed, totally absorbed in an effort to keep the law. I just don't think anybody's good enough to keep it all perfectly. Paul, in the book of Philippians, I just read it this morning in my quiet time because it's an encouraging book and I needed some encouragement. Well, in it, he talks about his pedigree. He was a Pharisee among Pharisees. As to keeping the law, he used a pretty strong word. I did it perfectly. But that isn't what saved him. As a matter of fact, living in that life kept him separate from the heart of God because it wasn't about grace. Okay, keep going. Verse 26. The next day, Paul took the men and purified himself along with them. This is all Jewish. This is all common practice for Jews in the first century. Before the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, this was a desirable practice among Jewish men. They wanted to make a vow and express the making of that vow by purifying themselves. This was a literal act of bathing. They were shaved. It was symbolic and literal. Then he went to the temple to give notice of the date when the days of purification would end, and the offering would be made for each of them. So this whole ceremony of purification wasn't we'll pop in there at 3:40 and at 4:40 we'll be all clean and shaven. No, there was a ceremony, and it took a number of days, at which time an offering would be made. And the implication up to this point is that Paul was going to be responsible for any of the financial aspects of this purification and the offering. When the 7 days were nearly over, well, that gives us insight into how many days? 7. When those days were nearly over, this could have been in the 6th day, some Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul at the temple. Now, you got to remember that the Jews in the province of Asia, this was Lystra, Iconium, Derbe. The Jews in those cities were, they were mean. And they truly, desperately hated Paul. They happened to be in Jerusalem, some of them. They spotted him, and guess what? All their buttons got pushed. They stirred up the whole crowd. There was almost always a crowd in the temple. I just don't think we have really anything as Americans in our world and our experience that would equate to the temple, what it meant, what took place there, how emotionally connected and attached the Jews were to the temple. There was always a crowd at the temple, especially during daylight hours, and the implication is this was during the daylight hours. They stirred up the whole crowd and seized him, shouting, "Fellow Israelites, help us!" Okay, there's a pretty strong possibility that they weren't known to the people in the temple, which is why they would have screamed out. It'd be like if I was in the bus station in Berlin and I wanted to stir up American fervor. I go, "Americans, all Americans, rally to me," which would be a waste of breath and time, but not in the temple. To rally the Israelites. This is the man who teaches everyone everywhere against our people and our law and this place. There was 3 things that consisted of a capital offense. They teach everyone everywhere. Okay, that's a little hyperbolic. They teach everyone everywhere against our people, against our nation, and our law, what the nation is founded on, our core values, our unique and royal connection to God and this place. Well, I already talked about how emotionally, I don't know what the connection is, not a strong enough word, but these people had a strong emotional tie to the temple. And so their accusation was, number one, he is teaching people against Judaism in its ethnic sense, Judaism in its religious sense, and even against the temple, the one physical symbol for us of the very presence of God. I mean, I don't know how else you could add to the emotional impact and strength of their message. Then they go on. And besides, he has brought Greeks into the temple and defiled this holy place. That was a bald-faced lie. He had not brought Greeks into the temple. Now, perhaps they had seen, well, it goes on in verse 29, they had previously seen Trophimus and the Ephesian in the city with Paul and assumed that Paul had brought him into the temple. Well, there it is. Assumptions are very dangerous things. Their assumption kicked off the first domino in a series of dominoes that was going to end not very happily for Paul. Paul had not brought Greeks into the temple. He had at least enough respect for the law, for the temple itself. See, it broke the Jewish law to bring a non-Jew, a Gentile, into the temple. It wasn't to be done. So it's like they were, let's dogpile with another thing. Oh, and by the way, not only does he teach against our people and against our law and against this place, he brought a Greek into this temple. Okay. You realize you're an adult and you can think, and you realize that a lie, when it's spoken with passion, is still a lie. It's always been this way. Extreme passion has almost always been the energy and the vehicle behind promoting a lie. Verse 30. The whole city was aroused, and the people came running from all directions. Well, number one, this is not, the culture in Jerusalem in century 1 was not at all what our culture is today. Realize that the businesses were all small businesses. Very few businessmen owned more than one shop. And they could close shop anytime they wanted to. And life was actually fairly mundane, even boring. And so when something was happening, word spread, like in junior high, fight. Next thing you know, you got a crowd of 300, right? Okay. The whole city was aroused, and the people came running from all directions. Seizing Paul, it got physical. They dragged him from the temple, and immediately the gates were shut, as though to say, "Get the filth out, slam." Why were they, did I mention it got physical? While they were trying to kill him, news reached the commander of the Roman troops that the whole city of Jerusalem was in an uproar. And next time, we'll talk about and then. I'll see you then on Soul Care with Stevie Boy.